Okay, in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the letters to the Thessalonian church. Um, let's begin talking a little bit about the geography and culture. Thessalonica was set along the Via Egnatia. The Via Egnatia was an important military east-west highway that carried commercial goods across Macedonia to the Adriatic Sea, a distance of over 500 miles. Along its length lay important cities of Macedonia: Philippi, Apollonia, Amphipolis, and Thessalonica. Thessalonica was the capital city of the Roman region of Macedonia, which was annexed by Rome in 148 BC. Augustus had refounded Philippi, Pella, and Dion as Roman colonies, where he settled Roman veterans as a reward for their service to Rome. Thessalonica and Amphipolis were free cities. When Paul visited the city, Macedonia was a senatorial province. In Paul's time, the city population was around 25,000, possibly as much as 40,000. The modern city is called Salonika. It was built over the old city. There is a downtown area where some of the old ruins can be seen. All of Paul's city is under the modern city, and it will never be excavated because they will not destroy the current city to pull it up. It was right on the edge of the harbor in Paul's day, the largest harbor on the western edge of the Aegean. It was a wealthy city, one of the more attractive places in the Aegean. It wasn't as rich as Corinth, but still well known. Luke calls the rulers of this city politarchs. For a long time, people thought Luke was wrong, but recently the term politarch has been discovered in excavations. Comparisons of Paul's references to the Thessalonian visit in his letters with Luke's account has led some scholars to call into question the historicity of Luke's narrative. Especially problematic, it is thought, are Luke's inclusion of Jews among the new converts and the suggestion that Paul and Silas spent only about 3 or 4 weeks in the city. Paul, it is alleged, would not have described former Jews or God-fearers as people who had turned to God from idols. That's what he says in 1 Thessalonians 1:9. And several details of his stay in Thessalonica do not square with a brief 3 or 4 week stay. For instance, Paul's claim to have worked long enough to set an example, 1 Thessalonians 2:9, and his praise of the Philippians for sending him money twice while he was in Thessalonica, in Philippians 4:15 and 16. But such criticism is unfounded. As Reisner has recently pointed out, the God-fearers who apparently made up the bulk of the converts were still, in Jewish eyes, Gentiles. Embracing the Christian faith would indeed have been a turn from idols to the true God. As far as the length of Paul's stay, 2 points can be made. First, Luke is in fact very vague about the length of stay. He claims that Paul and Silas preached for 3 Sabbaths in the synagogue and that sometime after that certain Jews instigated a riot. But how long after, he does not specify. A stay of 2 or 4 months is not at all unlikely. Second, it is possible that all the activity mentioned by Paul in the Thessalonian letters could have been accommodated within a period of about a month. Luke's account, while no doubt abbreviated, has every claim to represent accurately the basic facts of Paul's brief and interrupted stay in Thessalonica. Let's talk about 1 Thessalonians. The letter begins with the typical salutation in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, which mentions Paul, Silas, and Timothy as the senders of the letter. Paul then gives thanks for the Thessalonians and for their wholehearted commitment to the message the apostles preached to them, chapter 1, verses 4 through 10. The body of the letter falls into 2 obvious sections. The first, 2:1 through 3:13, focusing on Paul's interactions with the Thessalonians, and the second, 4:1 through 5:11, on Paul's exhortations to the Thessalonians. Paul begins by rehearsing the circumstances of his ministry in Thessalonica, chapter 2, 1 through 12. He then turns from the way he preached the gospel to the way the Thessalonians received it, giving thanks again for their reception of the word and reminding them that their very suffering is proof of their commitment and divine approval, chapter 2, 14 through 16. This same persecution forced Paul to cut short his stay in the city and aroused his fears about the Thessalonians' fortitude, chapter 2, 17 through 3, 5. But Timothy has arrived to report that all is well, chapter 3, 6 through 13. Paul begins his exhortations by reminding the Thessalonians of three critical ways they need to live in order to please God, chapter 4, verse 1, by avoiding sexual immorality, by loving each other, and by working hard with their own hands, chapter 4, 3 through 12. He then turns to an issue that was causing great distress among the Thessalonians, the death of some of their number. He emphasizes the advantages that the dead in Christ will have when the Lord returns, 4, 13 through 18, and encourages them to lead exemplary lives in light of the coming day of the Lord, chapter 5, 1 through 11. The letter closes in the typical way with a brief exhortation, a wish prayer, a request for prayer, and greetings, chapter 5, 12 through 28. Let's talk about 2 Thessalonians. Paul again associates Silas and Timothy with him in the salutation of the second letter, chapter 1, 1 and 2. The Thanksgiving section, chapter 1, 3 through 12, quickly moves into encouragement in the face of persecution. Again, a critical problem for the Thessalonians. It is probably this persecution that had led the Thessalonians into erroneous ideas about the presence of the day of the Lord, which Paul corrects in chapter 2, 1 through 12. Paul then exhorts the Thessalonians to stand firm in their faith and prays for their encouragement, chapter 2, 13 through 17. This leads Paul to request prayer for himself, Silas, and Timothy, that they also might be faithful in their ministry and kept safe from the persecutors, chapter 3, 1 through 5. The problem of idleness, mentioned by Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4, 11 and 12, has apparently worsened. So Paul launches an extended exhortation on the subject, chapter 3, 6 through 15. The letter ends with a brief wish prayer, an authentication in Paul's own hand, and a grace wish, chapter 3, 16 through 18. Let's talk about the author of these two letters. Three separate but related matters must be tackled. The first, the co-authorship of the letters. The second, the alleged interpolations in 1 Thessalonians. And third, the Pauline authorship of 2 Thessalonians. So let's go through each of these in turn. First, talking about the co-authorship of the letters. As we have seen, both letters name Paul, Silas, and Timothy as the authors of the letters. Yet the letters are traditionally ascribed to Paul alone. Is this fair? Many scholars say no. They note the way the first-person plural dominates both letters, even in the Thanksgiving section, which does not happen in most of the other Pauline letters, including three of them that name someone else in the salutation, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, and Philemon. The inclusion of more than one person in the salutation of a letter was most unusual in antiquity. Readers would probably have read the plural we as genuine indication of authorship. However, there is reason to pause before drawing this conclusion. First-person singular references do pop up in both letters, 1 Thessalonians 2:18, 3:5, 5:27, 2 Thessalonians 2:5, 3:17. These would be most unusual if the letters had been genuinely co-authored. The first-person plural may then be no more than a literary device, an authorial plural appropriate to the paranetic form of the letters. Perhaps, however, a mediating solution is best. Paul's mention of Silas and Timothy, because of their close associations with the Thessalonians, must be taken seriously. But Paul is the primary author. It is his voice that we hear in the letters, and their ascription to the apostle is not therefore unjustified. Let's talk about the second issue, interpolations in 1 Thessalonians. Although the Tübingen school rejected the Pauline authorship of 1 Thessalonians, few scholars have followed in their footsteps. 1 Thessalonians is one of the 7 letters ascribed to Paul that is included in the critical canon of authentic Pauline letters. But scholars do argue for interpolations, sections of the letter that are alleged to be additions to the original in 1 Thessalonians. Various scholars have singled out sections, including chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, and chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, but the only alleged interpolation that has drawn significant support is chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. These verses, it is claimed, must have been written after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, because the claim that the wrath of God has come upon them, that is, the Jews, at last must reflect the event of the fall of Jerusalem. Moreover, the apparently altogether negative evaluation of the Jews' final salvation conflicts with Paul's hope for the salvation of all Israel that he expresses in Romans 11:26. The difficulty of these verses, both in terms of their harshness and of their potential conflict with Romans 11, should not be minimized. Yet, we possess no textual evidence that these verses were ever absent from 1 Thessalonians. The idea that early Christians could easily have inserted passages into the letters of Paul they collected has no historical justification and runs into almost insuperable difficulties when the actual logistics of the procedure are considered. And we can also observe that Paul wrote Romans some years later, a few years later, and the thoughts he expresses in Romans might have been things that developed later. What Paul describes in Romans 11 about God's plan to use the Gentiles as a method through which all Israel could come to faith. Might have been something that developed after he wrote 1 Thessalonians. Moreover, the verses make good sense in their context. Paul's commendation for the way the Thessalonians received God's word and his encouragement to them about the persecution they are experiencing fit the theme of chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 very nicely. And the claim that God's wrath has now at last fallen on the Jews matches other New Testament assertions that widespread Jewish rejection of Jesus the Messiah brings to a climax Israel's sin and refusal to listen to God. Consider Matthew 23:32 or Acts 7:51 through 53. And the third issue we were going to talk about, the Pauline authorship of 2 Thessalonians. A far more significant problem confronts us when we turn to 2 Thessalonians, which claims to have been written by Paul, Silas, and Timothy. Moreover, Paul attests his personal involvement at the end of the letter. I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand, which is the distinguishing mark in all my letters. This is how I write. Chapter 3, verse 17. No responsible early church authority ever questioned Paul's authorship of 2 Thessalonians. It is included as a Pauline letter in Marcion's canon, which dates to about AD 140, and in the Muratorian canon, dating to about 180 to 200 AD. Very early fathers such as Polycarp, Ignatius, and Justin seem to have known the letter. Irenaeus quotes it by name. Despite this strong tradition, a significant number of contemporary scholars deny that Paul wrote the letter. Questions about Pauline authorship were first raised at the beginning of the 19th century, although they were not taken seriously until championed by F.C. Bauer in the middle of the century. Still, Bauer's general radicalism tended to blunt the force of his arguments against 2 Thessalonians, and all but a few scholars continued to favor Pauline authorship. But the arguments of C. Masson in 1957, and especially Wolfgang Trilling in 1972, have turned the tide of critical scholarship against the Pauline authorship of the letter. As a result, 2 Thessalonians is generally not included among the 7-letter Pauline canon within a canon accepted by modern critical orthodoxy. Several arguments against the Pauline authorship of 2 Thessalonians have been advanced over the years. It has been claimed that the vocabulary and style of 2 Thessalonians are distinctive when compared to the assured Pauline letters, but the wide variety of conclusions that scholars have reached using such analyses, combined with the need to reckon with the possible influence that Paul's co-authors or an amanuensis might have had on the Greek of the letter, have tended to diminish the number and effectiveness of such arguments. Another argument against authenticity focuses on alleged details in the letter that are claimed to reflect a post-Pauline period. The focus on traditions, or paradoxis, passed on to the Thessalonians in chapter 2:15, for instance, resembles the emphasis on sound teaching in the pastorals, also alleged to be post-Pauline by some. The eschatology of 2 Thessalonians, it is alleged, bears close resemblance to the eschatology of the Revelation, a late first century book. The portrayal of the man of lawlessness in chapter 2, 1 through 11, is said to reflect the Nero Redivivus myth, an urban legend that circulated widely in the years after the death of Emperor Nero in AD 68. And some have even suggested, and by the way, Nero had Paul put to death, so this would mean they're suggesting it was written after Paul had died. Some have even suggested that the combination of realized eschatology, seen in chapter 1, 2, verse 1 and following, and laziness, chapter 3, 6 through 14, reflects late first century Gnosticism. But these arguments are not given much weight in current scholarship. Contemporary analysis of apocalyptic tends to downplay the kind of historical reference implied in identifying Paul's man of lawlessness with Nero. The eschatological teaching of 2 Thessalonians contains nothing that could not have been current in the Judeo-Christian world of the middle of the first century. The craze to find Gnostics behind every New Testament false teaching tree has justly passed. And the reference to the traditions in 2 Thessalonians 2:16 is no different than the reference to the teaching in the universally acknowledged Pauline Romans 6:17. The contemporary argument against the authenticity of 2 Thessalonians focuses rather on 2 points that are at first sight paradoxical. 2 Thessalonians is too similar to 1 Thessalonians to have been written by Paul, and 2 Thessalonians is too unlike 1 Thessalonians to have been written by Paul. Let's unpack each argument before we assess it. First, let's talk about similarities to 1 Thessalonians. The basic argument here is that no author would duplicate material from one letter in another, written so soon after the first, when writing to the same audience. And they're saying that that's what's happening if Paul wrote both 1 and 2 Thessalonians. The opening salutations of 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians are closer in wording than any other two in the Pauline letters. But perhaps even more important than the verbal parallels are the structural parallels. Every major paragraph in 1 Thessalonians, it is claimed, has a counterpart in 2 Thessalonians. Both letters feature an unusual Pauline double thanksgiving, 1 Thessalonians 1:2 and 2:13, which corresponds with 2 Thessalonians 1:3 and 2:13, and a traditional benediction, 1 Thessalonians 3:11 through 13, 2 Thessalonians 2:16 through 17, as Ernest Best puts the argument. And this is a quote: "The structure of 2 Thessalonians is so similar to that of 1 Thessalonians and so dissimilar from that of the remaining Pauline letters that it could only have been devised by someone deliberately using 1 Thessalonians as a model." And let's talk about the argument about differences from 1 Thessalonians. For all their similarities, there are also striking differences between 1 and 2 Thessalonians. A few scholars have noted verbal inconsistencies, and others argue that 2 Thessalonians is more formal in tone than 1 Thessalonians. But attention focuses mainly on the eschatological teaching in the two letters. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul displays the strong sense of imminence so typical, it is alleged, of the very early church. He assumes that he will be alive at the time of the parousia, chapter 4, verse 17, "we who are still alive," emphasis, and cautions his readers not to try to calculate the times and dates, chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. The parousia appears to be just around the corner and quite impossible to predict. In 2 Thessalonians, however, the author warns his readers about thinking the parousia is imminent. Indeed, he lists events, the rebellion and the revelation of the man of lawlessness, that must take place before the Lord can return, chapter 2, 1 through 4. If 1 Thessalonians reflects Paul's eschatology, it is argued, 2 Thessalonians must reflect that of someone else. For those who find this pattern of similarity and dissimilarity sufficient reason to deny that the same author is responsible for both letters, several options are open. Harnack tried to rescue Pauline authorship of both letters by positing that 1 Thessalonians was directed to Gentiles in the church and 2 Thessalonians to Jews. E. Earl Ellis suggested that the first letter was written to the entire church, but that 2 Thessalonians was written to Paul's co-workers, the brothers of 2 Thessalonians 1:3. But insufficient evidence for such a change in audience exists, and Harnack and Ellis have had few followers. Others suggest that one of Paul's associates may have been the dominant voice in 2 Thessalonians, Timothy usually being singled out as the likely candidate. Childs thinks that 2 Thessalonians might have been written much later than 1 Thessalonians by a person under Paul's direction and signed by him to authenticate the letter. But Childs offers no convincing explanation for the situation that would have called forth the letter at such a later period. Most scholars who are convinced that Paul could not have written both letters opt for pseudonymity. They suggest that a follower of Paul's wrote 2 Thessalonians in his name sometime late in the 1st century. Such a procedure, it is argued, was quite acceptable in the ancient world as a way of carrying on the authority and influence of a great teacher from the past. Despite these arguments, a significant number of scholars, and by no means all of them evangelical, continue to maintain the Pauline authorship of 2 Thessalonians. They are unconvinced that the relationship of the letters requires different authors and are unpersuaded by the alternate accounts of the origin of 2 Thessalonians. We agree. I agree with this. I would build the case for Pauline authorship first by responding to the objections noted above, and second by bringing up what seems to be the insuperable problems in the way of pseudonymous theory. There are similarities between 1 and 2 Thessalonians. That's obvious, but these have been, I think, overdrawn. Exact verbal parallels are few. They're found mainly in the opening and closing parts of the letter. These are sections we would expect to find the repetition of kind of formulaic language. And the same is true of the allegedly close parallels in structure. Even if we look cursorily across it, we find that there are significant differences. For example, the second letter has nothing even remotely resembling the long section on Paul's interactions with and ministry to the Thessalonians that we find in the first letter in chapter 2, 1 through 3:13. More to the point is the issue of how best to explain the parallels that exist. Which is more likely, that an unknown follower of Paul chose a few passages and structural elements to duplicate, or that Paul himself, writing 2 letters to the same church with the same associates within several months, used some of the same language and forms in both? The latter scenario seems at least as probable as the former. A different issue arises when we consider the differences between the letters, for as we've seen, the main point of difference lies in theology. And here we face the possibility of a later Paulinist deliberately altering the apostles' original eschatology to suit the needs of a new time. This possibility only becomes likely if we conclude that Paul could not have held the eschatological views propounded in the 2 letters at about the same time. But we have no good reason to deny this. As we've seen, the main problem is that 1 Thessalonians seems to teach that the end is both imminent and its time incalculable, while 2 Thessalonians warns against imminence and claims that certain signs will precede the end. But many Jewish apocalypses contain the same mixture of imminence and warning signs. More to the point, we find this same mixture in the eschatology of the Gospels. Compare, for instance, Matthew 24:33. When you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Compare that with Matthew 24:44. The Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Paul's focus on imminence in 1 Thessalonians and on preliminary events in 2 Thessalonians arises because of different pastoral situations he's addressing. There's no good reason to deny that he could have held the 2 views at the same time as part of his overall eschatology. The different problems being addressed in the 2 letters require Paul to stress different sides of his stable eschatological teaching. In 1 Thessalonians, the concern is those who've died, have they missed out? And in 2 Thessalonians, there's this idea that it's already happened. To be sure, another factor comes into play. Many critics are sure that Paul could not have taught the eschatology of 2 Thessalonians because it would interfere with the popular scenario according to which Paul and other early Christians held to a strong doctrine of immediacy. Christ would come back within a few years, while only in the second generation did that hope wane, bringing with it the early Catholic notion of an indefinite postponement of the parousia. But without pursuing the matter here, there are other very good reasons to question this neat developmental scenario. Critics have simultaneously overemphasized the idea of immediacy in Jesus and the early church and downplayed the importance of imminence in later Christian writings. We find no reason why Paul could not have taught the eschatology of 2 Thessalonians 2, dependent as it seems to be on Daniel and the teachings of Jesus in about AD 50. Moreover, Nickel has recently put forward a plausible scenario in which both letters are replying to two stages of the same eschatological crisis. If he is right, the similarities and dissimilarities between the two epistles both make sense, and even the brevity of time during which they were both composed. If the reasons why scholars reject the Pauline authorship of 2 Thessalonians are not persuasive, even less persuasive are their explanations for an alternative origin of the letter. Scholars routinely claim that writing letters in someone else's name was a recognized and acceptable practice in the ancient world, but the evidence does not support this claim. Pseudonymous writings were, of course, quite common, especially in the apocalyptic genre of the Jewish world, but the evidence for pseudonymous epistles is meager at best. So the general notion that a follower of Paul's might have quite innocently and without any intent to deceive written in his name faces serious difficulties. The difficulties multiply exponentially when we consider 2 Thessalonians 3:17. I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand, which is the distinguishing mark in all my letters. This is how I write. Brown suggests that the theory of pseudonymity can be rescued if the writer symbolically insisting on the genuineness of the nature. If the writer is symbolically insisting on the genuineness of the message, not of the penmanship. But he provides no evidence that this kind of wording at the end of a letter would be taken in this way. Malherbe's judgment is on target. A pseudonymous writer who inserts such a claim, along with references to earlier oral and written teaching by Paul, chapter 2, verse 2 and verse 15, would have been audacious to a degree beyond belief. Since the reasons for rejected Pauline authorship are not compelling, and the pseudonymous alternative lacks credibility, 2 Thessalonians should be accepted as a genuine letter of the Apostle Paul. Before coming to Thessalonica, Paul had tried to go to Asia, then to Bithynia, but the Holy Spirit did not allow them to go into either place. Paul sought God, and when things did not go as he expected, he differentiated between Satan's hindrance and God's intervention. When God closes the way, there is no opening. When Satan tries to close the way, God opens the doors. Finally, Paul then had a vision in which he saw a Macedonian man calling him. He and his team immediately went to Macedonia. After preaching and being beaten and incarcerated in Philippi, Paul eventually arrived in Thessalonica, where he preached in the synagogue 3 Sabbaths. Then the Jews who had refused to receive his message, jealous that a great number of their Greek sympathizers had believed Paul's message, instigated a riot accusing Paul of sedition. Paul had to leave the city hastily. From Thessalonica, Paul and Silas went to Berea, where the Jews received his preaching much more readily, but he was soon chased there by the Jews from Thessalonica, and Paul sailed to Athens, leaving Silas and Timothy in Berea. When Paul arrived in Athens, he gave instructions to those who brought him for Silas and Timothy that they were to rejoin him as soon as possible. From Athens, Paul went to Corinth, where Silas and Timothy rejoined him. Luke tells us in Acts that both Silas and Timothy had been in Macedonia, indicating a broader area of work than simply Berea, and were reunited to Paul in Corinth. Paul mentions in 1 Thessalonians that they, plural, could not bear it any longer, and when they were in Corinth, they sent Timothy to Thessalonica to check on the fledgling congregation. Perhaps the instructions sent by Paul from Athens were more elaborate than Luke tells us. Most likely, the instructions to return to Paul as soon as possible included instructions to visit Thessalonica first. Since Paul only mentions a visit from Timothy to the Thessalonians, it is possible that he and Silas split up while in Macedonia before returning together to Paul in Corinth. Paul spent 18 months in Corinth ministering. During that time, he wrote both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Let's talk about provenance. Given the specific details provided in the letter, it seems clear that Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians from Corinth during his 18-month church planting ministry. Let's talk about the recipients. When Paul arrived in Thessalonica and went to the synagogue, he found that in this synagogue there were Gentile sympathizers who had not been circumcised. They were God-fearing Greeks. These God-fearers believed Paul's message. When the Jews rejected his message, Paul left the synagogue and went into the house of Jason, which is a Greek name. This Jason later took the bond on Paul's behalf when the synagogue Jews raised up a riot and went to Jason's house looking for Paul. Apparently, the church was established in Jason's house. Another convert was Aristarchus, who stayed with Paul to the very end. He was a Macedonian who was with Paul in almost every major city. Paul mentions them in the pastorals. From his very first churches, Paul establishes leaders who stay in ministry. Throughout his letters, Paul mentions 54 co-workers. Paul leaves the city and goes on to Athens. He decides to remain alone in Athens without Timothy and Silas. Paul sent them to Thessalonica to see how things were. Then Paul left to go to Corinth while they were gone. They came back and met him in Corinth. This is clearly the setting for the writing of 1 Thessalonians. In that letter, Paul mentions Timothy's return to him from Thessalonica. The believers in Thessalonica clearly were a group that had been powerfully touched by the Holy Spirit. Even after such a brief introduction to the gospel, throughout the years to come, Paul will reference the believers in Macedonia, of which Thessalonica was the capital, as examples of faithfulness and sacrificial service. The church was made up mostly of Gentiles, though it did include some Jewish converts. Let's talk about the date. As Paul describes his situation when writing, it is clear that he wrote from his time in Corinth on his second missionary tour. Paul's time in Corinth is the one solid dated event in his life, as the Gallio inscription, a message carved in stone that archaeologists have discovered, places the proconsul in the city from mid-AD 51 to mid-AD 52. Paul's 18 months in Corinth happened during the time Gallio was proconsul, as it was before him that the Jews brought Paul to accuse him. Both letters presuppose the same setting, and their similarities argue for a close time frame for composition. Thus, both 1st and Thessalonians can be dated to AD 50 to 52. Let's talk about the situation. Paul walked a very fine line in all his letters between being overbearing and offensive and being encouraging and showing confidence. He speaks candidly of sending Timothy to check on them, but goes on to say he was sure it would be unnecessary. But he did it anyway to be sure. He doesn't make them feel like they can't be trusted, but he makes his love and concern for them clear. Paul manages in all his letters to deal with all the issues that need to be dealt with, very ably balancing his words. There are several problems reflecting apocalyptic unrest that are apparent in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. One is militant messianism in the empire. Many suffered from a militant form of messianic expectations. This was stoked by the mad Emperor Caligula when he tried to send his image to be placed in the temple in Jerusalem. Jews throughout the empire saw this as the prophesied dreaded desecration of the temple, which must lead to the rising of a political Messiah. A second point, persecution. The Thessalonians had been persecuted because of their faith. The Jewish leaders they had in the past, The Jewish leaders they had in the past, The Jewish leaders they had in the past been devotees of turned against them when they no longer followed their teachings. And third, let's talk about Adventism. In 1 Thessalonians 1:10, Paul tells his readers to wait for his Son from heaven, that is Jesus. Chapter 2, 19 and 20, chapter 3, 13, and 4 and 5. The coming of Christ is a theme stitched throughout the letter. In Greek, the term is parousia. It means the arrival, and could be used simply to refer to someone's arriving. Used in this technical sense, it is the arrival of Jesus. There is no second coming, but there has not been this event before. Jesus' birth was not equated with this. The term parousia was not used to describe Jesus' birth. Origen was the first to use the term second coming. Early Christians spoke of the arrival. This is the idea of an emperor's coming to a city. The idea of a meeting. Paul is using the political language of the empire. He is using an important word. The person who has this parousia is the kurios, the Lord. This was the term used for the Caesar. The Jews in Thessalonica accused Paul of sedition, of claiming a different Caesar. A fourth issue, idleness. Problems related to the parousia led to idleness. The Greek word was ataktoi. If you were taktoi, you were the one who kept the rules, who stayed in line. Thus, an ataktoi is the one who is unruly. There were some apocalyptic bomb shelter mentality nuts who were not working and were just waiting for the parousia, sponging off of others. It is a common thing in apocalyptic sects that they withdraw from the world and engage in sexual promiscuity. There is the same strange mix in the letters of Paul. There's a strange eschatology where the end is near and rules don't apply. True Christian eschatology is a call to holiness and preparation, not lawlessness. And a fifth point, false prophecy. There were people in the congregation who were uttering things contrary to what Paul had taught. 2 Thessalonians is written in response to a false teaching. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul does not want them to quench prophetic utterances, but they must examine these carefully, and when they are false, they must be rejected. When leaders rise up, they often explain away their departure from Scripture. The biblical truth is one of strict examination. And what is the purpose of these letters? In response to the favorable account brought by Timothy, Paul covers some important subjects for these new believers. In these two letters, there are 5 things Paul wants to do. He wants to, 1, give encouragement to a fledgling church facing the wrath of jealous Jews. 2, he wants to defend his own conduct and the integrity of his ministry. 3, Paul wants to present a model of holiness for personal behavior. 4, Paul wants to respond to concerns regarding believers who have already died and what will happen to them when Christ returns. And 5, Paul wants to correct a laziness that has crept in, tied to a misconception about the appearing of Christ. So basically, in all these things, Paul is seeking to affirm and strengthen the faith and holiness of the Thessalonian believers.